So the topic of the paper that I'm talking about is racial differences in student access to high quality teachers. And there are three authors, me, Helen or Sonny Ladd, one and the same, Charles Clotfelter, and Calen Clifton. Are we on yet? No. So there are three parts to this presentation. Let me just say one introductory comment. There's no causal modeling, no equations, nothing difficult in this presentation. We think it's provides some important policy relevant information that policymakers need to deal with to address some of the challenges we arise. So there are three parts to my presentation. We're still not up. We want to document racial disparities in access to quality teachers. And we're using student race. So we have white students, Black students, and Hispanic students. That's the first part, just documenting disparities for the state of North Carolina. And then the second step is to decompose the racial disparities into differences that are attributable to differences within schools, across counties, across schools within counties, and then across counties within the state. And then once we've done that decomposition, we want to spell out some policy implications for policymakers at all three levels, at the state level, at the district or county level in our case, and at the school level. So that's where we're headed. And we start out with the data that we're using. We're using data on student and teacher characteristics for every student in the state, but just at 5 grade subject levels. So we do it we're looking at 4th graders, we're looking at 7th grade English and 7th grade math, and 10th grade English and 10th grade math. And putting this data together was complicated because we use course membership data, administrative data from the state of North Carolina, and we have it at the school level, and we know what students are taking math, but we don't know initially that they're all taking the same math course in the 7th grade. So we have to make sure that we assign every 7th grade math student to math course, either the required math course or something similar to that. So that's the use of course membership data. And then we're using teacher data because we're interested in how the link between, or the relationship between the students and teachers. And we use, we need to look at data on teacher characteristics. Now we're using credentials data. We have 6 sets of credentials that we use for teachers, 3 that we refer to as depicting characteristics of strong teachers, and 3 that we refer to as depicting characteristics of weak teachers. So for strong teachers or strong credentials, we're using teacher experience, a teacher with 5 or more years of experience. We're using high licensure test score being in the top quarter of the Praxis distribution. We're using whether or not the teacher is nationally board certified. And in North Carolina, we have a lot of nationally board certified teachers. For weak credentials, we're using inexperience. That's 2 or fewer years of teacher experience. We're using low teacher test scores, bottom quartile of the Praxis on statewide, or whether the teacher is not certified in the area of teaching. So 3 strong characteristics, 3 weak, and we can add them together in a sense. We've got positive, it's positive if you have access to a strong teacher, and it's negative if you have access to a weak teacher. Now I'm about to show you, I hope, some graphs. So what are we doing? We're just doing something very simple. It's descriptive. We're measuring the statewide, the proportions of white, Black, or Hispanic students who are assigned to teachers of each, with each set of credentials. And you'll see this in the graphs in a minute. And then all we're doing descriptively, we're comparing the proportions of white students who have access to quality teachers, or lack of, or inexperienced teachers. And then we're doing that for each racial group and then comparing them. So it's pretty straightforward. It's descriptive, but important stuff, I think. Now we
Just keep talking.
I can't, well, now I'm showing you a graph. So we've got, on the left-hand side, we've got 5 grade subject categories. You see 4, it says 4, and then 7th math, 7th English, or 7th, which grade is it here? English. 7th English, 7th math, and then 10th grade English and math. So the vertical is just the grade subject level. And then can we go back to the graph?
Yes, we're going to screen share for the recording. One moment.
Oh, okay. Now the horizontal axis is going to be just shares of teachers. And so, but the tricky thing with the graphs is the horizontal axis is going to differ from category to category because we've got many more experienced teachers than we have teachers with high praxis exams. So the horizontal axis differs a little bit. I don't want that to confuse you. And when you have a chance to look at the graph, what you'll see is the horizontal axis is in decimals. So the first, for experienced teachers, it's going to go from about 0.7, that's 70% of the teachers, to about 8.1, that's 81% of the teachers. And I hope we're going to have the graph pretty soon, because the importance of the graph is, and I want you to get ready to look at the
There are
the
graphs.
black, diamonds that are in black, over here on the right, are referring to proportions for white students. And the diamonds on the left in these first 3 graphs are referring to the proportions for Black students, and the other ones with the gray are proportions for Hispanic students. So when we look at experienced teachers, and remember what those 5 rows are, it's different grades and subjects. What jumps out, should jump out at all of you, is white teachers in each of these grades. Elementary school, middle school, and high school have greater exposure to experienced teachers. That first graph is all experienced teachers. The second graph is high praxis teachers, same basic pattern, but the proportions are different. And down here is whether the teachers have access to national board. And you can see in all cases, the diamonds that are colored in black, which refers to the exposure of the white students, are always higher than the proportions or the share of teachers that either Black students or Hispanic students are exposed to. Now, these are all the strong qualifications of teachers or strong credentials. Let's go to the next graph. The next graph is for weak credentials. What's going on in this graph? In this case, the white students that show up with the diamonds in black all have much less exposure to these teachers with weak credentials than is the case for Black students. Black students are way over on the right in these graphs, and the Hispanics are in the middle. So descriptively, it's pretty clear statewide that white students have access to stronger teachers or less access or less exposure to the weaker teachers. Now, there are a few other things we could say about this. We were worried that, well, these are statewide patterns. Maybe they're just driven by what's happening in a few specific big urban districts, of which we have some, and then we have lots of rural districts. So we redid the analysis separately for each county which are mainly our districts in North Carolina. And we find the patterns are pretty widespread. Not surprisingly, though, the gaps, the racial gaps, are bigger in the bigger counties and in the counties with characterized by greater racial segregation. Now, that's the first step, just descriptively. The second step is to decompose these differences into ones that are attributable to differences across classrooms within schools, across schools within districts, but I will often refer to them as counties because those are the same almost, or in many cases, the same in North Carolina, and then across counties. So let's go to the next graph. We do that? We've done this graph. We need to go to the next picture. The next
Wait, yep.
picture is showing our, here we've got our decompositions. Let's just start at the top. So at the top, we've got fourth graders, and we've got two lines there, two bars. One is white versus black, and one is white versus Hispanic. The length of the bar is the difference that showed up in the previous graphs between whites and blacks, or between whites and Hispanics. And we've decomposed them so that if you look at fourth grade white versus black differences, what you see is that black, small black area over to the left in that first bar is the share that's attributable to differences across schools. Plus,
I think that's within schools, within schools.
yeah, it's called within schools there. It's the differences across classrooms
Within schools.
within
Yeah.
schools. And that's very small in the fourth grade. That shouldn't surprise you. Now that dark black, if you go down to the other classes, you'll see in some grades, subject grades, bigger, seventh grade math and seventh grade English, seventh grade math and 10th grade math, the share attributable to differences across classrooms in schools is larger as a percentage than it is for fourth graders. Now, the middle part, the gray part in each bar is the portion attributable to differences across schools within counties or within districts. And then the unshaded part on the far right in each bar is the portion attributed to differences across counties within the state. Now, the reason we did this decomposition is we wanted to think about policy implications. We're really quite concerned about these racial disparities in access to quality teachers. And so then the question is, what can be done about it? Well, the bottom line here is we're going to need actions from at the state level policymakers. We're going to need actions at the county or district level, and then certainly some action at the individual school level across classrooms. So let's look at some of the policy options that we've thought about. So if we go to the next slide, it's called illustrative policy options. So state level. Now, the state level options are going to vary a bit across states, depending on the role of the state. North Carolina, the state plays a pretty big role in education. 60% of the funding comes from the state, and the state has a statewide salary schedule, but one that the local districts can supplement with their own taxes. So we do have variation in salaries. But so as you think about this, you know, the policy options might differ a little bit from state to state, but in all cases, state government's going to need to pay attention to the total supply of teachers. We know if there's a shortage of teachers, the burden of that is often going to show up for the students in the schools where there are lots of either Black or Hispanic students. Other actions here, we need to reduce teacher gaps across districts. And in North Carolina, there are big teacher quality gaps across districts. And one way to deal with that is to pay higher salaries in the districts where there's a shortage of quality teachers. And so policymakers in North Carolina are thinking about increasing salaries in those areas. But I want to emphasize the other part of this. It says raise the salaries in low wealth areas, but we also need to do other things to attract teachers to those low wealth areas. We may need to provide housing or other supports for teachers. And there's now a lot of discussion about that to attract quality teachers to those areas. And then we could talk about shortages in different subject areas. And one policy solution to that might be to have fellowships for teachers. But if you're going to have fellowships to try to attract teachers into the profession to teach special ed and other things, you also need to pay attention to where those teachers who get the fellowships end up teaching. And so let me go to the next one. So that's state level policies. We need to talk about policies at the district or county level. And here, the most obvious one is to reduce the school segregation across schools within a county. I've noted at the top, some of these are hard to do. I mean, we could say, well, let's just reduce racial segregation. That's very hard for many districts to do, and I want to acknowledge that. So if you can't reduce the racial segregation across schools, is there anything you can to reduce the differences in the quality of teachers across the schools in your district? And I've listed out some here, but I want to turn your attention to the last one here, where it says provide better mentoring support in high minority schools, schools serving large proportions of often low income Black and Hispanic students, designed to improve the quality of teachers and to induce them to stay in the school. I mean, we've looked at the articles, and this, I want to highlight this because it comes back to some of the discussions about induction policies and support for the teachers who are already in the schools, rather than paying the much higher salaries that you might need to induce teachers to move to those schools. So let's go to the next slide here. This is, we got it, school level policy. So now what we're talking about is disparities in access to quality teachers within schools. A lot of that, but not all, but a lot of it is due to academic tracking. And that's why more of it shows up in 7th grade math and 10th grade math than in 4th grade, whatever. So you could just reduce that tracking. Again, that may be feasible in some places and not in others. One suggestion we have is to reduce the tracking in the 8th grade algebra courses. If kids are tracked in the 8th grade, some getting algebra and some not, by the time they get into high school, they're going to be in tracked classes. So some thought to reducing that at the middle school level could be helpful here. Second thing that's listed here is the assignment of teachers to classrooms within the schools. But notice I noted that this is challenging because teachers are mobile. So you have a school and you recognize that stronger teachers are teaching the stronger students. You try to move them around. Teachers are mobile. So unless you say teachers can't move from one school to another, that's going to be challenged. So maybe what you do is if you have academically tracked classrooms, maybe the policy solution is to make sure all teachers in that high school or wherever you are have access or end up teaching classes of different with students of different characteristics, so that within the school you equalize things. Now, which of these are most feasible? That's for policymakers to determine, but there is research on a lot of these options. And I think it's our responsibility as researchers to keep pushing policymakers. So the bottom line, may I go to the final slide? The bottom line is there are pervasive gaps, racial gaps in student exposure to teachers with strong and weak credentials. We have to acknowledge that. And then the question is, how do we deal with it? And second message here is that we need policymakers at all three levels, state, county or district, and school, to confront the disparities head on and to come up with and to pursue a range of policy mechanisms to counter them. So the bottom line is reducing racial and disparities in access to quality teachers represents a serious challenge for policymakers, but one we think is important and needs to be pursued with a whole range of policies. No simple solution, but it needs to be pursued aggressively.
Great, thank you. Okay, so give me only 8 minutes so that we have some time for questions, and also because this paper by Sunny just presented actually sets up what I'm going to be talking about really well. I'm hoping I can get some slides, but I want to like jam through them fast. Can I actually do it? What we're going to be doing, and the where is. This is where am I? Yep. Okay.
I'm supposed to stay here in case there's
Yep,
questions.
yeah,
Sorry.
So this is a paper that I did with Matt Kasman from Brookings, who is over in the other side of the room. First time I've met Matt in person, which is nice. And some folks that were all at one point out at the University of Washington, Vanessa, Roddy, and Malcom. And it's a nice compliment to what Sunny and all did, because what we're doing is we're trying to figure out the degree to which the gaps, and we focus on teacher experience, appear to be driven by hiring within profession, mobility between schools, and attrition. Right? So that's the basic setup. And the idea that the reason why you kind of want to figure that out is because people are thinking about addressing these experience gaps, but they don't, I would argue, have a very good idea at sort of what part of the process do you want to focus on if you want to try to reduce teacher quality gaps, as I'm going to call it, right? And hint, hint, there are teacher quality gaps in Washington State, just like Sunny has demonstrated that there are teacher quality gaps in North Carolina. Again, we're using experience as our measure of teacher quality gaps. This is where I talk fast and go through a couple of these slides. We're decomposing the difference between novice teachers, and this is teachers with, I don't know if it's 2 or less or 5 or less years of experience, between, within district and between districts. And this is Washington State. You find a gap of about 4 percentage points differential in the likelihood that underrepresented minority students are exposed to novice teachers. About a quarter of the teachers are novice. 16% of the teachers are novice. So this is about a 25% differential in the likelihood of getting a novice teacher. And this was true in every year that we looked at the data. This is an old, paper, but I thought it set up this paper nicely. I didn't think I was going to need my break glass in case of emergency. What did we find slide, but I clearly do. Okay, so how did it get this way? Is this about the attrition, the differential attrition between different kinds of schools serving different kinds of students? Is this about differential mobility between schools? Is it about differential hiring? Well, it turns out it's about all 3 of those processes, which is not super surprising, but it is much more about mobility and hiring than it is about attrition. And I'm going to try to quickly kind of prove that to you. All right, so I don't have time for these fancy slides, but the way that the model works is that we are estimating the probability that teachers of different experience level leave different kinds of schools. we're estimating the probability that they move between schools, and we're estimating the kind of teachers that get hired. And we're doing it in that order, if I said it right. Attrition, mobility, transfers between schools, hiring. All right, that's the way the model works. And so for everyone in Washington State, over a 13-year period, we can assign a probability as a teacher that you're going to make some kind of move, or you're going to move into a different kind of school. And then we can run simulations to see how closely do the results of the simulation end up comporting with what we actually see in terms of these teacher quality gaps over time. And we can also simulate what would happen if there was equality in one or more of these processes, so that it looks like there wasn't differential attrition across different kinds of schools of experienced teachers. So the first thing, I don't have time to sort of run through this, but there it is. So the first thing is just to point out, if you focus on these bars, novice teachers are much more likely to leave than non-novice. And again, these are two years or less. But the differential between schools that are serving, are there in quartiles 1 to 3 students of color, underrepresented minority students of color, I believe. This differential is actually bigger than this differential. So teachers with more experience are disproportionately more likely to attrit from schools serving high minority student populations, right? So this happens, we see some attrition, then there's some mobility between different kinds of schools. And again, if you focused on these bars, if I had time to explain it, you would see that there's more likely to be mobility between schools for schools serving high shares of students of color. And lastly, when teachers are hired, and I do have a second to explain that, the lighter bar is quartile 1 through 3 students of color schools. The darker bar is quartile 4. So if we just focus on the new teachers that are hired conditional on a prior vacancy, that you can see the quartile 1 through 3 schools are about as likely to hire a more experienced versus novice teacher, whereas the quartile 4 high share of students of color schools are much more likely to hire a novice teacher. All right. So the first thing is to see how well these simulations work, right? So what we do is we use these 13 years of data. We start in 2001, 2002, and start going forward with the data to see how closely, if we set the inequities that we observe in the hiring, mobility, attrition to be like the state. How closely do our simulations end up paralleling what we actually see? And then we simulate what happens if we set different processes to be equal, right? I don't have time to run through all of the assumptions of the agent-based models. I think and there are a lot of assumptions. These models take a long time to run. We have to make some necessary kind of assumptions to get the data set to work. We think we've picked some reasonable assumptions, perhaps with the exception that the way that the processes change is basically through colleagues. So we allow the models to have an impact on like the likelihood of hiring a novice or experienced teacher, given the composition of the teachers that are already in the building, but we don't allow for changes in the student composition over time, which is probably a limiting factor. Okay, so yes, you accept all those assumptions. Okay, if we start with all process, so we start with what things look like in year 1, all processes are inequitable, which is the way it turns out it is in the state. What we're looking at is the true value of these teacher quality gaps. Again, this is the differential between novice and non-novice for different kinds of schools versus the simulated teacher quality gap, which is the solid line. And they track pretty closely, and it's within the confidence interval of the estimates. So it looks like it does a reasonable job of actually capturing what we would expect. All processes are equitable. Over time, you approach no teacher quality gap, which is the way the model should work, because if you don't have an equity in these processes, you would trend toward no gaps. Okay, what happens when we allow specific attributes to change, specific parts of the process? When only attrition is equitable, you don't actually get much closing of the teacher quality gap. It's the difference between the dotted line and the solid line. So the solid line is below the dotted line, but they're both within the confidence interval. So it's not a huge reduction. If mobility is the equitable process, then you can see that the dotted line hasn't changed because it is the truth, right? But the solid line, the simulated line, is now far below the dotted line, and the confidence intervals are also below the actual. And if hiring is equitable, again, it's a bigger kind of bump. So our take is that mobility and hiring turn out to be kind of more important than attrition. But if you look at a lot of the policies and the sort of the discussion about this issue, people tend to focus on attrition. So it's not that it's unimportant, but it is, I think, not as important as these other processes. And I would especially put an emphasis on hiring, because I don't think we know much about hiring and the way that happens in schools, and the way the match is being made between applicants and school systems making decisions about applicants. I think we're starting to learn more about it. There's a good paper by, I think it's Jesslyn James and Matt Kraft and others looking at Tennessee and Boston public schools that's starting to shed some light on that side of the labor market, but we don't know a whole lot about it. I'm going to skip all of this. The one parting thought before we get to questions. I'm out of time, right? Yeah. All right. The one parting thought is that ESSA supposedly requires that states describe these kinds of inequities and have a plan to do something about it. And there's not actually that much. There's not evidence that states are doing this across the board, and it's kind of interesting. It does seem like some states are just sort of more or less ignoring ESSA. Okay, so that's it. It's your turn. For people who have questions, let us know if it is for Sunny or for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Then it's for you. And one comment on what you just said, I'm working with the state on their equitable access work, and they keep asking, would the Department of Ed approve this? And I don't want to tell them that they are one of the only ones who are actually doing something about it. I want them to keep, the suspense of would they approve it. There's only a handful. The attrition finding reminds me of that finding and the attrition from the diversity piece. If we keep every teacher of color, the marginal impact or the effect on diversity of the workforce is very marginal. But then we ask the question of how many teachers of color are there to keep? How many experienced teachers are there to keep? And did you try to combine hiring and attrition to see?
You'd have to look at the paper, but we did all the various combinations. But the way that we defined experienced versus novice, my recollection is that it's like 80+% of the workforce in Washington in the latest year is experienced. Matt, and then, sorry, Steve has the mic, then Matt.
So these papers are connected and really interesting. And I just want to think about, and it was a comment Mohammed made this morning, that I know Sunny and Charlie have written about if we pay teachers additional to work in high poverty schools, pay experienced teachers more money, then you get more teachers. But you don't necessarily get better outcomes because experience is not very predictive of the quality of the effectiveness of teaching. And what we see from Dallas is that if you pay more effective teachers a lot more money, you get huge improvements in achievement. Why isn't that the simple solution? Not only teachers, but pay school leaders a lot more money if they demonstrate it to be effective, so that we can actually get educators, be they in poor rural areas or high poverty urban areas, in places, because you talk about, it's mobility and it's hiring. And so I guess I wonder, why isn't that the main right answer?
That's directed to Sunny, right?
Well, part of it, we don't have good value added measures for all teachers and certainly beginning teachers and whatever. So I'm not a big fan of test-based value added measures. But having said that, I want to come back. You referred to work that Charlie and I did. We looked at how much it would cost to get experienced teachers to move into, say, high minority, low income schools. And we concluded it would cost a lot of money. And that's because those teachers, the high quality teachers often care less about salaries than other teachers do. Have I said it right, Charlie? That sounds right. And so it's not a very effective way. So you could do it with salary changes, but it would be costly. So that's why I come back to the policy recommendation that I made at the end, which is instead of trying over and over again using value added measures or using some other measures like much higher salaries to get these teachers into those schools, I'm all for higher salaries, but I don't think it's going to solve the whole problem. I'd rather keep some of those teachers who are already in those schools, who are willing to teach in those schools. I'd rather work harder to make those teachers strong so they do a better job of teaching within those schools. And so then they're happier staying. So maybe I'll get good principals in those schools as well.
So my view is different. I think it's cheaper to keep people from moving than it is to induce someone to make a move.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that kind of a medium would be to identify the teachers that are effective and serving in high poverty schools and try to get them to stay there with higher salary. And I actually do think that there are some of those kinds of policy experiments. Like we've talked a little bit about DC, we've talked about Dallas. I think that is akin to that policy experiment, and it seems like it's successful. Politics is one of the reasons why that, in answer to your question, that doesn't happen. And I would say, given the political constraints, then I would focus on, looking at someone who's a novice versus like 5 or more years of experience, because I think that's probably the one of the second best proxies that we have, because we know teachers get better typically when they are early in their career. Yeah, Matt.
There's a recent book out by a sociologist, Doug Downey, and that I happen to be reading on the Amtrak up here. And he marshals a bunch of different data and evidence that shows that there is not really inequity in how much students learn during the school year. That the learning trajectory of low-income students is very similar to the learning trajectory of high-income students during the school year. And that the achievement gaps we see are explained almost entirely, or he would say entirely, at least the socioeconomic gaps, based on outside of school factors and entrance levels. And so I'm wondering, Dan, how we can square that with the large body of teacher quality evidence that does suggest inequitable distribution.
I mean, I'm not sure I agree. I don't know the book. I'm not sure I agree with that premise. So I do think that there's some evidence that the differential learning is associated, at least partially, with the differences in teachers that you get over time. So if you look in any particular year, the gap is maybe to your eye not huge, to one's eye not huge, but like if you get that kind of gap year after year after year, then that presumably the differences in value added or experience or however you want to measure teacher quality, that they do accumulate. But is it all about what's going on in schools? Surely it is not, right? Like a lot of how well kids are doing has to do with out of school factors.
I mean, the Chetty New York City paper found that the inequitable distribution of teachers explained 4% of the low income, high income achievement gap. Does that seem credible to you? Does that seem too low? Like how, because I think a normal person might say that seems very small.
Does it, I can't remember if that was just in the differential in a year or if that was an accumulation. If it's a differential in a year, that seems credible to me. I think that there's some estimates that if you're looking over a number of years, that it is higher than 4%, but it's not 50%, you know, it's 20 to 25%. Maybe Stephen, maybe like Stephen, and maybe one more question.
Turn it on or?
It's probably on.
Okay. Everyone- yeah,
No.
okay. So my question is just that, you know, a lot of these gaps we've talked about for, you know, for those that like still forever, like for a very long time, right? And but I also feel like the policy context is trying to fix this feels a little different, especially when you look at surveys of satisfaction and profession. And I know some of them surveys, you know, they've changed over time, and I'm always a little bit skeptical of them. But basically, the teachers are really unhappy and very stressed out right now. I think, you know, when in the teacher evaluation stuff maybe a decade ago, I mean, teachers felt that as distinctly punitive, even though I think a lot of people, you know, very much were doing everything they wanted schools to improve and for the equitable distribution to some of the here was talking about.
But also, I just, every time this comes up, I think it's important to note that there were not a lot of teachers that actually lost their jobs.
True, and
Yeah.
I think that like the perception of what the reforms did versus like the way it felt are two really different things.
Yeah.
But I guess I do wonder, is there a way to design these things that be a little bit less, you know, just like this on teachers, other ways to do them? I don't know, I guess it's just something I really think about now when you look at, you know, and I know that if you're saying they're thinking of leaving, it's totally not the same thing as them actually.
Yeah.
But it's just something
I'll throw out two kind of concrete ideas. But like you're asking the wrong person because they are political ideas about how to do something that is akin to what we think we could do if there was the political will to do it. But I think that there's increased evidence that who you work with as your mentor matters. And so you could imagine kind of creating a career path for people who are eligible to certain, you work with as your mentor matters. And we don't really pay mentors very much money given the import of the role. So you can imagine creating a career path where some segment of the teaching population is eligible to serve as a mentor teacher, and they get paid more for those extra duties. And I think there's probably less resistance politically to paying someone for taking on extra duties than there is, you know, paying them like in DC because they get better evaluation ratings. So that's, I guess I'll just throw out one idea in case there's one last question. Go, yes. Sarah.
I can just talk loudly. So my question is about whether there are, whether you know of work or have thoughts on working conditions that might might help make teachers want to go to these schools, and sort of related to that, how COVID and that sort of in competing the work from home changes that like as a major work amenity that is not going to be available to teachers. And do you see that changing, like the difficulty of attracting?
This is a good sunny question. I'm going to say take 10 seconds to say, whatever you do, right? Whether it's working conditions or it's pay, it's whatever it is, it has to make the schools that are tough to staff, relatively more desirable. And so when I hear lots of times policymakers talking about this issue, they say, we're going to make all the schools better. And the problem is that I don't think you would, if all the schools are better, there's still some schools that for whatever reasons are relatively more desirable. I don't think it would change some of the phenomenon that we've both shown you. All right, Sunny.
So I agree that working conditions matter, and North Carolina has had a working conditions survey for teachers for many years. And I used that several years ago to look at which aspects of working conditions were most likely to make teachers say they wanted to stay in the school, or they did. And leadership in the school played a big role. So that takes us back to the importance of principals and leadership and support for teachers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please join me in thanking everybody. I'm going to apologize for myself because I'm literally running to the airport. It was great to see everybody. Thanks to all the presenters. It was just good to see people in person. Thank you.